in alphabetical order of presenters, but we ended up with the three Irish papers, three papers on Irish topics together, and it's worked perfectly so far. Very good. So we're moving on now. The last couple of papers, this next two, are also recorded. This one is from, I don't know where Dundalk is.
It's near the border, isn't it?
Near the border.
Yeah, north.
Yeah, near which border?
How many is there?
Okay, and it's Colleen Savage, pre-recorded as with Cara.
That's right, yeah.
That's
And
right.
I just wanted to say that Colleen's just texted me. She's just noticed immediately there's a bit of a giveaway here. She was meant to give this paper to ICTMD in Ireland conference, and she was unable to do so for various personal reasons. So she's hoping that you'll enjoy it, and so it is very much intended for us here, and she's very grateful that it's been accepted for this conference. I don't think the apology was in any way necessary, but I'm sure you'll enjoy the paper.
Is Colleen online as well?
Colleen is online too, yes.
Right,
We
okay.
hopefully can beam her in at the end as we did.
Okay, yeah.
One dear morning as my rambling steps did lead me down by a far station through many countries long, I heard great lamentation that the weepers they were making, saying, "Well, no more engagement with boys of Mullaghbawn." It has always troubled me that I never really understood the meaning behind the song, "The Boys of Mullaghbawn," and although it is a staple in my own repertoire, I've always been intrigued by it, and its true meaning always had eluded me, until now. During my research, I came upon a quote from London, and it struck a chord. It reads, "It is a strong belief of mine that in order to understand songs about an event, it's necessary to know the utmost about the event, the people involved, and the place." With that in mind, I set out to get under the hood of this local song by uncovering the utmost about the event, people, and the place. We are fortunate that the verses to this song are quite stable. The earliest print versions comprise 5 verses. The first verse relates to hearing lamentation of some news, the second to asking of a favour and of treason, the third to compliment the Squire Jackson and the mention of a vile deceiving stranger. The fourth verse refers to heroes crossing the ocean and the confusion of nature of the fact. And the fifth and final verse to combination and being sent for transportation. There are several schools of thought as to what the event the song "The Boys of Mullaghbawn" tells of. Some believe it's about the abduction of an heiress, others about the transportation of men who were charged with combination, that is, membership of an illegal group such as the Defenders or the People Day Boys, and which was outlawed via the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800. Others believe it's about a group of men who were seized and sent on board a ship by press gang. Some believe it's a song about the United Irishmen and the time of the rebellion of 1798. However, with the mention of combination, transportation and the Squire Jackson, we can conclude that the song documents events which followed his death in 1787 and the instability which followed. Disturbances and violent unrest characterised this time, sometimes agrarian, between and amongst tenants, landlords and clergy from both Catholic and Protestant denominations, which have been discussed by such scholars as O'Worry, O'Sullivan, Madden and Behan. Janine Elaine Behan states, "It is clear that following Jackson's death, instability had occurred amongst tenants of the Forkhill estate, and it could be suggested that the resultant unease was a contributory cause of the disturbances which followed. Madden asserts the settlement of unleased lands on the estate upset the existing social order. Local people were displaced, a foreign population was introduced, and a tighter measure of outside authority was imposed. In response, the defenders, who comprised members of the local community, rose up against such imposed foreign authority, and those who were part of that hierarchy became legitimate targets, which included landlords, tithe and cess collectors, or anyone who imposed plantation, burdensome impositions by bodies in which the defenders had no part. A cursory glance at the Assizes book dated 1776 to 1797, held in Armagh Robinson Library, documents the serious crimes of the time, some of which emanate from these same disturbances in Forkhill Parish and the wider South Armagh. One of the most documented is the attack on a man called Alexander Barclay in January 1791. In the case of an account given to folklore collector Michael J. Murphy from Frank Wings Campbell, entitled Barclay and the Boys of Mullaghbawn, it is thought that the inspiration for the song came from this event. This view is also supported by McLaughlin. The song, therefore, is to enlist and illustrate sympathy for the band of men who were prosecuted for the attack. Alexander Barclay, a local schoolmaster, was at home in Mullaghbawn with his wife and a 13-year-old called Nathaniel Thompson, when a band of men entered their property and proceeded to maim and attack the three by cutting out of their tongues, fingers, and in the case of the 13-year-old, part of the calf of his leg. Campbell asserts the attack to be in reprisal for the ousting of a local school teacher called Keane, and that Reverend Hudson had dismissed Mr. Keane wrongly to make place for Barclay. The Assizes book illustrates the prosecution of the men by Barclay, supported by Nathaniel Thompson. Reverend Edward Hudson, who also attended proceedings, served as rector of the Forkhill Parish from 1779 to 1795, and was one of the appointed trustees of the will of landlord Richard Jackson, following his death in 1787. He was also manager of the estate, who opposed in earnest the development of a Protestant colony. Those listed as the prosecuted include Terence Byrne and Peter, Thomas and Lawrence Murphy. Peter was known as Captain Peter Murphy, leader of the defenders. They were charged with felony and maiming. Peter was found guilty and ordered to be hanged at the bridge in Forkhill on the 3rd of May 1791 and gibbeted. Separately, James and Pat Connery and George Byrne were found guilty of a string of offences against Barclay: felony, cutting tongues of Barclay and the leg of Thompson. Madden discusses the act of the cutting out of tongue was likely to discourage in the most strongest terms, symbolically and actually, his inclination to testify against defenders at their trials. Barclay's name appears as prosecutor along with a Mr. Duncan against Michael Donnelly and Lawrence Connery earlier in 1789 and again in 1790 for assault, robbery, firearm offences and later for cut and stabbing, for which Donnelly was found guilty and hanged. Madden tells us that shortly after, Mr. Duncan fled the parish, but Barclay, he stayed behind and assumed the responsibility of answering for the execution. So what are the other clues that tie the event and the song together? The reference to a vile, deceiving stranger who has ordered transportation is understood to be the Reverend Edward Hudson, whereas, and in contrast, Squire Richard Jackson was reputedly held in high regard amongst his tenants. Squire Jackson he's unequalled for honour or for reason, he never turned a traitor, nor betrayed the rights of man. The punishment for such crimes included transportation for those who avoided hanging, and it's thought that the pardon for such could come from the noble lady who lives near to Finay, that being Nicola Ann Hamilton, surviving wife of Richard Jackson, who originated from County Cavan, and Finay being on the County Cavan-Westmeath border. Finally, the song implies a betrayal by a member of the community, an informer in verse 4, the cuckoo that left her station, who Campbell in his account asserts was Berkeley's wife, which leads me on to the song entitled Seamus Bui. The song Seamus Bui in Yale appeared in print on the 22nd of September 1906 within the Irish column of the Dundalk Democrat newspaper. The song tells of a man called Seamus who, as a result of his false testimony, has brought about the untimely death of Mixie. This song ensures the act of treachery committed against Mixie would not be forgotten by those who had heard it. Comprising 5 verses, the song is in stark contrast to that of the Boys of Mullaghbawn, in that the author is unequivocal in the naming of individuals who are party to the events of the song itself. 5 people in total are named: Seamus in verse 1 and 3, Mixie in verse 1, 2, 4 and 5, Hudson in verse 1, Hardy in verse 3, and Myra in verse 4. Here is a literal English translation of the Gaelic song. Ugly Seamus O'Neill, may you never be happy all of your life. May your children never prosper. You put Mixie in an early grave with false oaths. There is scarcely anyone in the place who has survived Hudson unharmed. Verse 2 speaks of the blood of Mixie being on the forehead of O'Neill on the day of judgment, while verse 3 tells us of the townlands or places O'Neill would come to have should he hang a man called Hardy. In verse 4, we hear of how his daughter Myra will not be able to find a man because of the actions of her father, and how Mixie did not present a gun or a pistol until O'Neill swore he was a rogue. And finally, verse 5 is the voice of O'Neill himself. Manly or brave Mixie, should you suppress the English, may you not be put into the ground or a coffin until your yellow neck be throttled. While we may be unaware of who Seamus or Mixie is, there is no doubt who Hudson is. The same Reverend Edward Hudson, the vile, deceiving stranger. We can tell that Seamus, Mixie and Myra are all Irish names, and by consequence can assume that they are all locals, not English. In the case of Seamus, we can assume he would have been known as James O'Neill, yet we don't know who Mixie is, his surname not included, yet we can assume he was known as Michael. Using archival material to help me generally date and place this song, I began with looking at the period where Hudson was rector in Forkhill, 1779 to 1795, plus perhaps another 10 years. A search of the public records in Belfast produced some interesting finds. The registered freeholders of £20 and 40 shillings lists a John Francis and James Hardy of Ballinalis, also known as Ballinaless, a townland located in Killeavy, close to Camla Lake in South Armagh, which isn't far from Flockaletra, where the McGilla Jackers are found. However, I could not conclusively link Hardys to the townlands or areas named in verse 3 of the song, but it is a possibility that Hardy was a landlord in control of land within these townlands, but subletting perhaps to local tenants, while himself living in Ballinaless, which is true in the case of a James O'Neill. This document is a lease dated the 1st of December 1790 between Susanna Barton, Ravensdale, County Louth, and a James O'Neill, Carrigaladreen, County Armagh, relating to land at Carrigaladreen for the sum of £6 and 8 shillings. Susanna was the widowed sister of Richard Jackson. Jackson, upon his death, had left his property bound up in trusts to his wife Nicola Ann and to his sister Susanna. Carrigaladreen is located just west of Mullaghbawn village. The document also mentions a Terence O'Neill and a Charles O'Neill as sons to James. There's a barely legible handwritten note in pencil on the back of the document, which lists the tenants on this land as Terence and James and John O'Neill, along with a Sally Cotter. This land is leased for him and his family, and the remainder sublet to other tenants. This document is a further lease, dating from the 1st of November 1790, between Susanna Barton and Brian O'Neill, James O'Neill, William Robinson and Edward Crilly of Forkhill, County Armagh, relating to land in Longfield, County Armagh, for the sum of £16 and 15 shillings. While this document is a sublease agreement between a Henry Hughes of Longfield and Thomas Ford and James O'Neill of Carrigaladreen, County Armagh, dated to the 6th of April 1792. These documents tell us a number of things. The first is the existence of a James O'Neill, who had several leases with Susanna Barton, the sister of Squire Richard Jackson, and additionally had in place subleases with members of the local community, particularly in Longfield and Carrigaladreen. Therefore, he himself was a landlord and part of the middle class, and by consequence, perhaps, just the sort of individual to take advantage of situations and antagonise the neighbours. O'Neill is also illiterate. I also found evidence that James O'Neill was involved in the administration of cess collection in the parish, a tax imposed on all members of an Irish parish for the upkeep of the local Anglican church. Turning to the recovered 1821 census of the parish of Forkhill, 31 years after the dated indentures, within the townland of Carrigaladreen, we find James O'Neill on a 3.5-acre holding at the age of 70. At this time he is a widow and his occupation is listed as a farmer. Present is his son Charles, a labourer aged 40, and a servant named Peter Doyle, aged 11. His son Terence, aged 46, also resides in the same townland on a 4-acre site. In terms of the naming conventions of sons, there is some evidence of the handing down of names within a family, where the eldest son is named after the paternal grandfather, second after the maternal grandfather, but never after the father. That is reserved for the third son. It's no surprise, therefore, that by 1864 we find a further James O'Neill, a direct descendant of our 70-year-old 1821 census James O'Neill, within the valuation of tenements located in Carrigaladreen. And what of his daughter, Myra? I earlier referred to the account collected by Michael J. Murphy from Frank Wings Campbell, entitled Barclay and the Boys of Mullaghbawn. The excerpt states that the teacher in Old School in Adano, Forkhill Parish, said by narrator to have been a Catholic. At least he lived as a Catholic, and he was married to Myra Wee Bui O'Neill of the Rotten Rocks in Longfield. You better not mention this, mind you, even yet. If this is correct, then Myra Bui, or Mary O'Neill, is the wife of Alexander Barclay, the daughter of Seamus Bui, who would not get a man in the area because of the deeds of her father. However, according to this account, she did marry. She married a Protestant man, a linen weaver and a school teacher, Alexander Barclay, and suffered the most horrific end. According to Musgrave, they cut out her tongue, they cut off her 4 fingers and thumb with a blunt weapon, which operation took them up above 10 minutes, 1 or 2 of them holding up her arm while they committed this inhuman action. They then battered and beat her in a dreadful manner. It is said that they cut off one of her breasts in the attack, and she died of her injuries only days later in Dundalk Infirmary in January 1791. Not satisfied with this revelation and link, I began to trawl all the accounts I could find again which detailed the attack, and coming upon a paper by Harold O'Sullivan, he states, "They cut off Berkeley's tongue and the fingers of his right hand, similarly mutilated his wife Mary, who subsequently died in Dundalk Infirmary." Campbell asserted that Mary O'Neill was the cuckoo who left her station by either informing or perhaps marrying an outsider who testified willingly against local men of court. Then the song Seamus Bui in fact predates her death in January 1791, and indeed her marriage. And so Myra herself is the link between the song Seamus Bui and that of the Boys of Mullaghbawn. There is no surviving a complete heir to this song. However, a small snippet of verse 5 has been uncovered within the National Folklore Collection of University College Dublin. It is of an unnamed male singer from the 1920s, and the recording made by Father Lorcan O'Murray. Following a process of listening intently and plotting the air and sharing it amongst our participatory action research group members, of which I'm one, I conclude it closely resembles the final bars of the P.W. Joyce air, The Boys of Mullaghbawn, albeit with subtle differences. Notwithstanding, I believe it's possible to utilise the Joyce air to inform a melody to match this Irish song. While it's a work in progress, I leave you today with a verse as we end. Therefore, I conclude that there are tangible links between both these songs. Both document a time of disturbance, dated to pre-1788 and more likely around the time of Edward Hudson and his tenure in Forkhill. I contend that Seamus Bui predates the Boys of Mullaghbawn. Irish was the community vernacular amongst the native population and utilised to communicate within and between the community. It would not have been understood amongst the English, and in that way was a song to be shared and sang amongst this native community. Therefore, I consider this to be the earlier of the two. Additionally, the song has not been sanitised, in that it contains critical information which not only roots it to location, but it is also wedded without ambiguity to specific and named individuals from that same community. There are many further lines of inquiry to explore, and I have enlisted the help of a local genealogist who has told me that she has met a lady who is a direct descendant of Myra. My next step is to corroborate the marriage between her and Alexander to confirm that she was O'Neill by her maiden name. I would like to establish this link conclusively, which hinges on the testimony of Frank Wings Campbell. I would also like to identify Mixie. There are lots of archival sources to explore. The Armagh Money Hearthrolls, a further assizes book in Prony, not to mention the assizes of Forkhill, Dundalk and Monaghan, where crimes were also heard, and thereafter to seek out newspaper reports to narrow who the hangings were of that time, and if there was a prosecutor named James O'Neill, or even Hudson himself, who provided testimony against Mixie. I have nothing official to implicate James O'Neill as yet. However, I firmly believe that if someone took the time to write about a betrayal, then something may reveal itself in time within the archives. For now, I have to be satisfied that the heir to one song can be recycled and repurposed to inform an heir to enliven the other, and in this way, this song may once be sung again. And that I have perhaps uncovered part of the story of Myra Bui and the Boys of Mullaghbawn.
Hello, Colleen.
Hello, I can hear you a little bit.
Hello.
Hello, Colleen. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for that. We do have 5 minutes for questions. Can I ask the first question? I'm a bit confused about the chronology of the songs.
Okay.
The incident, the thing took place in the 1790s, but the first version of the Boys of Mullaghbawn are broadsides. Of what date? Do we have a date on those?
Actually, the dates that I have, I think the first version I have in the Bodleian library is from, I think, 1860 something or other. But those ones that I have on the image came from ITMA, and they were actually P.W. Joyce's as his booklets that he had cut out clippings,
yeah.
But none of the books are dated.
Yeah.
But I know that he got them from Ballad sheets. But I think in the Bodleian library is the earliest one.
So that's 60 years after the event.
Yes.
Yeah, roughly. And the Irish one in the newspaper was 1901. Was that the earliest version of the...
It is, and it's the only version that we found. So it was taken directly from an informer, an interlocutor, like an informant, a man called Michael Tierney, who was one of the last Gaelic speakers in his area. So somebody had came along and collected that song from him, the Irish version of that song from him. So what we think is that the heir to Seamus O'Neill is actually the heir to the Boys of Mullaghbawn from the fragment that we have. So it's not that the songs talk about the same event in any manner, but it's that the heir was probably popular or well heard at the time, and then was repurposed for what we know in terms of the Irish language version of the Boys of Mullaghbawn.
Right, so the song was knocking about somewhere for 100 years without us knowing?
Yes, so basically the song Seamus Way has been transmitted via the oral tradition amongst the community, surviving amongst that community for as long as the Irish language survived. And then you obviously had a period where, the Irish language died, it died out over, you could say, in the space of a generation. So the only way that people were communicating in that way would have been in the home. So Michael Tierney was one of the last Irish speakers, so we had that song, and that wasn't uncommon. Songs were collected from some of the last Gaelic speakers in the area, from collectors who would come in the area, either record them if they had the ability to record them on a mechanical device, or more times than most, what they were doing was taking the song down by hand, and then that song was being published in a paper in years and years and years later, whenever those papers came to light. And it's not that we don't have a print version of an air to match that song, but what we have got are excerpts from wax cylinder recordings. A lot of them are uncatalogued at the minute in University College Dublin, and we're able to identify and tie them simply by trawling the archives and looking at things like, for example, the Dundalk Democrat, the earliest prints of it, because we know that's where most of their material was shared years after they had died.
Yeah. Thank you, Colleen. Sorry, I'm hogging the questions. Anybody got any? We've still got a minute or two. Anybody got any questions or comments?
That might sound really confusing, that answer.
No, that was fine. That was exactly what I was trying to get to the bottom of.
I suppose for me the biggest revelation was realising the link between the two songs was actually the daughter, because when Seamus Quinn was written, it was written about her father and about his acts or how he's interacting with local people in the community.
you know, and one of the verses being, you know, my real daughter will never get a man because nobody will take on with her because of the deeds of her father, as nearly as if she's shunned from the community. And then she reappears then in the Boys of Mullaghbawn. So that's what, according to Frank Wings Campbell.
Yeah, thank you. Steve's got a question. Steve.
Yeah, just the tune that that your song was being sung there. That it seemed to have some affinity with the one of the hunting tunes that's used quite well. It might even be related with the Killaruddery hunt tune. Not sure there, but certainly a Scottish border tune for a hunt.
Okay. Well, the earliest version that I'm looking at is the 1901 version from P.W. Joyce that appeared, and it said in that account, I think, that he got it from a schoolmaster in Carrickmacross, which Carrickmacross is only about a 10-minute drive from here, so it's very closely linked geographically. So it was obviously a tune that existed within the local community. And that's as much as I know about the air in terms of the P.W. Joyce air.
Thank you, Colleen. We're going to have to move on now because we have one more paper. Round of applause for Colleen. And our last paper is also recorded. Hilary Warner-Evans, who some of us have only recently met on Zoom. I'm going to be talking about songs from Maine. She gave us a TSF talk a couple of months ago, I think it was, on a different aspect of this particular song tradition. And there she is. Hello, Hilary. Good to see you.
Just make sure I've got the right thing here. Sorry, start again. So I'm trying to get it full screen. Managed it twice, it's not going to work the third time, is it? Right, let's just start one more time. Third time lucky.
Hi everyone, my name is Hilary Warner-Evans and I just defended my PhD thesis in folklore.
So just going to see if I can make that full screen, bear with me just a minute.
Hi everyone, my name is Hilary Warner-Evans and I just defended my PhD thesis in folklore at Indiana University earlier this month. The presentation I'm giving today is based on one of my thesis chapters about sense of place and the songs of Bert Bailey. I gave a sort of part one of this presentation at the March TSF meeting, where I talked about how Bailey's songs could be considered local based on their incorporation of real people and place names, description of economic activities, attitudes toward the natural environment, and use of local history and legends. Today I'm going to complicate what I said in that presentation and explore how Bailey's songs differ from what folklorists have more typically studied as local songs and why that is. I'm also going to discuss how that has affected their performance contexts and audience reception during Bert Bailey's time and more recently. My primary sources for this presentation come from my own and others' oral history interviews, as well as archival research at the Phippsburg Historical Society. So Bert Bailey, who is pictured there on the left, taught at a Quaker boarding school outside Philadelphia, and in 1927 he and his family started spending the summer on the coast of Maine in Phippsburg. He wasn't unusual in this respect. Coastal Maine had become a retreat for wealthy summer people from at least 50 years before the Baileys started visiting. But Bert was unusual in that he and his wife Helen eventually ran a camp on their summer property between roughly 1935 and 1949 called Three Fevers Camp. And you can see their beach there in the other photo. The camp began with Bert's former students doing service work projects in the nearby fishing village of Sebasco, and later incorporated local teenagers doing service projects in all the Phippsburg villages. But Bert's legacy in Phippsburg also lies in several songs he wrote that take place in the town or on the Maine coast more generally. The songs are fictional, mainly humorous, and mainly narrative. Most of them deal with maritime economic activities such as lobstering, clamming, fishing, and boat building, although two of the most popular happen to be about ice cutting and seeing a moose while gardening. Bert's songs were set down by his daughter Ellen a couple of years before his death in the 1970s in a manuscript titled Saltwater Ballads and Some Not So Salt. The origin story that people tell today about the songs goes that when Bert first started spending summers in Maine, he thought he'd find local folk music, but people were just playing the country western music they heard on the radio, so he decided to write his own songs. They're considered local by Phippsburgers today because they deal with local topics. However, they differ in flavor from what folklorists have more typically called local songs. In this presentation, I suggest that this difference is a result of the way in which Bert was attached to Phippsburg as a place, versus how the local people at the time would have been attached to Phippsburg. In this presentation, I'll utilize key terms from Timothy Cochrane's 1987 article on place and folklore on Isle Royal. Drawing on work by Edward Relf and Yi-Fu Tuan, Cochrane argues that once island residents knew the island was going to become a national park, their attachment to place shifted from that of existential insiders or being rooted toward that of empathetic insiders having a sense of place. Cochrane notes that, quote, a person is an existential insider or rooted if she feels a complete identity with a place, feels as though she belongs to some place, while, quote, in comparison, empathetic insiders are more removed and more aware of their relationship to a particular locale. The empathetic insider feels a sense of belonging to a place, but is more self-consciously aware of how that place appears vis-a-vis others. While Bert Bailey had a genuine desire to connect with the locals and understand Sebasco, Phippsburg, and Maine from their perspective, his own attachment was that of an empathetic insider. And although Bert's familiarity with Phippsburg is attested to by the realistic detail of the songs and the accuracy of their settings, they differ from what we might consider existential insider songs, local songs more typically studied by folklorists. By contrast, most of the residents of Phippsburg during Bert Bailey's time would have been existential insiders, less consciously aware of the relationship of their place to the outside world. And here we see Maine, Phippsburg in red there, and a more detailed map of Phippsburg. When Bert started coming to Maine, about 6 villages within Phippsburg played a role in providing localized services to residents. Prior to the 1950s, most villages had their own store, 1 or 2-room school serving students through 8th grade, post office, and church. Because the villages were largely self-sufficient, people from one rarely interacted with those from the others. Jean Scott from West Point noted, quote, we each had our own school, our own church, so we didn't have to go anywhere. We all had our own store where we bought our food, and most of them ate from the sea. So we didn't really have to go anywhere, and we really didn't get to know the kids until we got into higher grades and went into Bath to Morse High School. Jean Flink, who grew up in Center, stated that, quote, at that point Phippsburg was very discreet. Each section of the town was very discreet with its own school and so forth. Bud Alexander said that the villages were, quote, close-knit when he was growing up in Sebasco, and that, quote, he never went up too much to the rest of town. The lack of paved roads and distance to Bath, which is as many as 15 miles from some parts of Phippsburg, would have meant that journeys to town were infrequent, especially because cars were few at the time. While those who had the means to do so could go to Morse High School in Bath and meet young people from other parts of Phippsburg in the Bath area, without a school bus, this was an avenue closed to many until the late 1940s. The lack of travel and social mixing would have made people at that time less aware of other places. Two of the most obvious ways Burt's songs signify localness is with the use of names of real Phippsburg places and people. However, the ways in which they do this indicates their difference from what folklorists have typically studied as local songs, which are often high-context songs containing specific detail of interest to an insider audience, but that might come across as boring or unintelligible to outsiders. In his chapter on the local song in Yorkshire, Roger Rennick quotes Frank Kidson's views on a North Riding hunting song as saying, quote, "Like all songs of its class, it runs to about 20 verses, and prowess of every fox-hunting squire and yeoman of the district is chronicled. Highly interesting to those who know the descendants of the persons mentioned, but rather monotonous to the general reader." This kind of song is what John Ashton, giving several examples from Newfoundland, describes as a moniker song. Historically, there have been examples of these types of songs from Maine also. For example, 19th century songmaker Amos Hansen of Orland, in the schooner Fred Dunbar, has 3 verses just listing the crew of the ship. Lake Chimo, an account of a camping trip near Old Town, Maine in 1871, recounts the members of the camping party in 1 verse. While the particular verse listing individuals was included in the version of the text given by Mrs. Josiah T. Taylor, daughter of one of the camping party in Minstrelsy of Maine, it was not in the version sung by E.V.P. Chick for Phillipsbury in 1932 that was printed in the Bulletin of the Folk Song Society of the Northeast. Fanny Hardy Ekstrom and Mary Winslow Smythe note that the song has never been, quote, printed in its entirety, except for early copies printed in Boston for the camping party. Perhaps the extra verses, including the one listing names, were seen as extraneous by people who did not know the people in question and simply got cut. Interestingly, contemporary Maine singer-songwriter Gordon Bok also left out the moniker verses of Schooner Fred Dunbar on his album Schooners, although acknowledging in the liner notes that there were more complete verses. In both cases, the list of names is what gets dropped. A similar process may have taken place with Burt Bailey's songs and the selection of what to include in saltwater ballads. A couple of Burt Bailey's poems that did not make it into saltwater ballads are more similar to what folklorists have generally termed local songs. One of these is a parody of Cape Cod Girls, in which some of the verses included descriptions of various Sebasco villagers. Some of these were serious and plausible, such as Charlie Gomes is a good shipwright for all whose boats are watertight. Others were clearly supposed to be humorous, such as Abby Wallace is a gay young thing, she's always hankering to dance and sing. Since Abby Wallace, the local midwife, was about 66 in 1940, this would have struck people who knew her as funny. A second poem of Burt's is titled Old Will Dunning, about a local boat repairman. This poem mentions specifics of Will's fixing boats, such as the tools he uses, but also, quote, his rags of philosophy, perhaps a nod to how Will was once known as the best preacher in the countryside. Unlike the songs in saltwater ballads, nothing much happens in these, and they might be considered boring for people who don't know the individuals in question. The humor certainly wouldn't have landed. Although few real individuals populate some of Burt's other songs, the names are arbitrary beyond simply being used to signal that they are of Phippsburg. And the names are not necessarily needed for the audience to enjoy the songs. It is the fictional stories that make them interesting. For example, Thomas Topman from the horse ballad never owned a horse or was involved in ice cutting, but a song about Thomas Topman running the town would certainly be more boring to a wider audience than one about an ice cutting horse. The way in which Bailey's songs use place names also speaks more to an empathetic insider sense of place. They use toponyms to signal their localness, referring specifically to the Kennebec River, Casco Bay, Saginaw County, Phippsburg, and the villages of Parkerhead, Popham, and Small Point. While this technique of name-dropping Phippsburg places, seemingly from a map, marks the content of the songs as connected with the local place of Phippsburg, it presumes an outside perspective of telling rather than showing. Moreover, the way these place names are sometimes used in Bailey's songs indicates an awareness of places vis-a-vis the outside world. Both the Big Bull Moose and Sandy McNabb tell the listener point blank in the first line that they take place in Phippsburg and describe something about it. Phippsburg town's in Saginaw, where the air is fog and the soil is rock. And Phippsburg is rich in the blood of the Scot. A man is a Wallace more often than not. Longtime residents, however, wouldn't need to be told where Phippsburg is or the ancestry of its people. They would already know these things. Moreover, just as with the personal names, these place names are irrelevant to the song's plot. If the Big Bull Moose were located from the existential insider perspective, it would more likely launch right into the second verse, detailing how Clifford Robinson saw a moose in his pea patch. Outsiders would have no idea where the song took place, but insiders would know the presence of Clifford Robinson's pea patch meant it happened at their house on the main road close to where the fire station and school are today. Another of Bailey's songs indicates a self-conscious sense of place in an even stronger way. The horse ballad refers back to a time when Charleston and Baltimore boasted the price, and the schooners were loaded with Kennebec ice, thus indicating a sense of local pride in the past influence of Maine's ice-cutting industry on places further south, part of what makes Phippsburg distinct vis-a-vis other places. The origin story told today about Bailey's songs implies that they were written for local Phippsburgers. However, it seems they were by and large not sung by locals during Bailey's life. The major singing context of the songs seems to have been on visits the camp made elsewhere, during camp reunions in Pennsylvania and gatherings of summer people in Phippsburg. And although people say the songs were written for Phippsburgers, it is more likely that was never Bailey's intention. There is, after all, no mention in the archival record of Burt writing the songs to be sung by Phippsburg locals, while there are a couple of mentions of writing songs for the campers to sing. These are not songs written for existential insiders, they were written for empathetic insiders who felt a connection with a place, but sung them mostly in other places as a way of remembering and reconnecting with that place. Although there are references to singing in general at camp, few of these are to Burt Bailey's songs. This situation is corroborated by camper Bill Match's recollections. Quote, "We didn't tend to sing many evenings at Three Fevers, especially when the Sebastian youngsters were with us, but what we sang was old favorites. UB's ballads," that's Uncle Bird, "were rarely a part of those evenings. Occasionally one was requested and performed, say once in 2 weeks, but rather as we were providing entertainment on a visit elsewhere, Vinyl Haven for one, than at Three Fevers itself." Similarly, in a 1932 letter to a friend, Bert's daughter Betty mentions singing, quote, "our Maine song" for the boat captain on the way to Booth Bay. The Maine songs were sung for people when campers were on trips. During Bert's lifetime, his songs were also sung at reunions of campers, part of a number of ways of reconstructing Three Fevers at such events. A report of a gathering at the Bailey's Sunset Hollow farm in late 1945 refers to, quote, "singing the Maine songs, bringing back the physical and emotional feelings of being in Maine." One from the following year mentioned that, quote, "singing old camp songs brought us even more deeply into the mood of an evening around the fire in Maine camp, and the final 'Now the Day is Over' completed our evening in Maine." Burt Bailey's Maine songs then were mostly sung as an expression of locality, not at camp itself, but when in a situation that included outsiders. Their role as local songs was to present Phippsburg to other places. Songs that express an existential insider sense of place would have been sung in local contexts for local audiences, and indeed would have probably been unintelligible or boring to outsiders. Bailey's songs, however, were sung in contexts expressing localness to those not from the area, thereby expressing sense of place of empathetic insiders who are conscious of how their place appears to others. More recently, however, the songs have been sung in Phippsburg for local audiences. Earlier in the 21st century, Bailey's songs were sung at Phippsburg historical and commemorative events by the Macy Family Band, largely made up of people who had grown up summering in Phippsburg and moved to Maine year-round, some of whom who had known Burt. The Macy Family Band brought Bailey's songs and band leader Dick Kelly's Phippsburg songs to the wider Phippsburg community, a group that was not necessarily familiar with them. One of the events at which the songs were performed was a festival commemorating the 400th anniversary of the failed popping colony in summer 2007. Another was the Vicksburg Bicentennial Concert in January 2014, held at the Center Congregational Church. Jean Flink noted that when the group performed the songs at the church, people were, quote, intrigued by them. These performance contexts also relate to Vicksburg's pride of place, something connected with the sort of self-consciousness that comes with empathetic insidedness. The more recent interest in Bert Bailey's songs can perhaps be tied to a change in the place attachment of the audience. While most Vicksburg locals of Bert Bailey's day would have been existential insiders, today they tend more toward the category of empathetic insiders. During World War II, people from the more isolated villages in Vicksburg started to get jobs at Bath Iron Works, building warships, and new people moved into town for this purpose as well. While Vicksburg had about 800 residents when the Baileys first started summering there and was at the tail end of a decades-long population decline, by 1940 there were around 1,000 people, likely because of people moving into the area to work for BIW. By 2006, 78% of the Vicksburg workforce worked outside of town. The other factor generally mentioned in ending isolation of the Vicksburg villages is the mixing of young people because of broadening educational opportunities. The opening of the Central Elementary School in 1958 helped to alleviate hierarchy between the villages, and bus service to Bath for higher grades was in place by the fall of 1947, allowing Vicksburg students to get to know those in Bath and other nearby towns. Better roads and more cars also made travel easier. In contrast to the time when residents relied on their villages for nearly all services, today these services are either centralized within Vicksburg, as in the case of the elementary school and post office, or outsourced to Bath, as in the case of the supermarket and schooling beyond 5th grade. And the demographics of the town have continued to change as well. More summer people and tourists come for one thing, and more people have moved to Vicksburg full-time. In 1990, Vicksburg's population surpassed its previous 1850 high of around 1,800. Bud Alexander noted that same year that, quote, "There's so many from out-of-state people that's brought into Vicksburg now that the town is more or less getting together." In 2018, Jean Flink told me that, quote, "We grew up on the river right down here, and you could look across to Arousik and it's just trees, and now there are houses." These changes have made people in the previously more isolated villages, such as Sebasco, more aware of other places and thus more consciously aware of their own place. The changes in town in recent years and a desire to preserve its character has been noted in town planning. A 2006 comprehensive plan included maintaining the rural character of Vicksburg as one of its key goals. In the description of the rural character, the report included the town's geographic isolation, tradition of maritime activities on its waters, and the individuality of the villages. The same report acknowledges changes in the town. Quote, "Due to changing demographics, the nationwide decline of small farms, and the drastically changing fisheries, Vicksburg has evolved into a bedroom community." Geographer Doreen Massey, drawing on David Harvey, writes that in today's world, quote, "The growing mobility and internationalization make our old notions of places as settled, coherent communities more difficult to sustain. But the very fact of heightened spatial mobility and the feeling that we live in an increasingly unstable and uncertain world also makes us need even more strongly that notion of place as secure and stable." Because of the lessening of isolation, Vicksburgers' increasing status as empathetic insiders have made interest in the category of local songs more prominent as they seek to articulate their distinctiveness from residents of other places. And Bert Bailey's songs portray a vision of Vicksburg in line with that ruralness that the community leaders want to preserve. So thanks for listening today. I'm planning to be live for the Q&A, but just in case the tech fails, this is my email address here, so you can feel free to email me any questions and comments as well.
I go for to switch on. Yep, you on.
Hello, Hilary.
Hello, Hilary.
Hi.
You can hear us, we can see you.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent, thank you very much for the paper. We do have time for questions. Look, we've all been sitting here for a long time. This is the end of the afternoon for us. I don't know what time it is there. But any questions or comments? Yes, over there.
Yeah, I'll just give us an idea. Could you give us some idea of the map that you showed? What the distance was from top to bottom of that map, just to give us some idea of scale.
Yeah, so it's I think it's like somewhere between 15 and 20 miles. Sorry, I should probably convert that into kilometers for you.
Good, thanks. Yeah.
So that's not really very far from top to bottom, 15 miles, 20 miles. And you're saying that the people at one end...
Yeah, so it's the third map, that is. So, I mean, it doesn't seem that, it's not that far in a car, no. But, you know, if you don't have a car, it's very difficult because some buses that go down there. And it's, yeah, so I think it's probably like maybe about 20, yeah, it's probably about half an hour to get between in driving today, but back then it would have been a lot more difficult. The speed limit was lower and most of the roads were not paved.
Henry, were you saying that the songs now are becoming popular with the people who have roots there, or they're becoming popular with the incumbent families? Who is it that likes these songs now?
Yeah, so actually, to be honest, I don't really know, because I wasn't present at those concerts and they're not happening anymore. But I know when Jean Flink was, when I interviewed her, she told me that a lot of the people who had come to that bicentennial concert were people who had newly moved into the area. And so that might be, so it might be mostly people who are newcomers. I think she mentioned that the people there wouldn't have been familiar with the songs because they didn't know Bert, because they were not around when he was coming into town, basically. And so I don't know if, like, I think maybe thinking that they're popular with people in Pittsburgh now is a bit of an overstatement for me to say, but I do think that they, you know, people responded positively to them, enjoyed listening to them anyway. I don't think people have then gone and started singing them themselves, but.
But you can imagine them being more interested in the moose in the pig patch than in a list of names of people, as you say.
Yeah. So actually, there's something else that I didn't include in this paper, which is that there is a young man now who is singing and writing songs about local topics in Pittsburgh, and he's from a family that's been there for a while, and so he performed some of these songs at a benefit concert for a museum that's being made right now, a small museum about the fishing heritage in Pittsburgh. And there's one song that, like, he sang at the end of the concert that I was told that he always sings it last because everybody cries at it. And so, like, that song, I think, really responds to, yeah, I guess people's sense of, like, the maritime occupations in Pittsburgh, because there are still quite a few people involved in lobstering and clamming there. And so that song, I think, that one is definitely popular nowadays. So it's not just Bert Bailey's songs that were revived in the 21st century. There's also now new material being written, and part of this museum is also going to talk about the musical traditions of Pittsburgh. And so the Murphy family, whose house is being used for the museum, were, they mostly, I think, played gospel music, but their music is kind of, there's kind of the point being made that there were people playing music in Phippsburg at the time, and it might not necessarily have been about local topics, but the fact that there is a quote-unquote local music tradition is important in this, I guess in terms of, yeah, and like seeing that Phippsburg has a music tradition, basically.
Great, thank you very much, Hilary. I think we've got to wind up there. Thank you again for joining. What time is it there? Where you are?
It's 10 a.m.
10 a.m. Right. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. A round of applause. Right, so everybody, ladies and gentlemen and others, and thank you for coming. It's been a really good day. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot, so I'm glad we did it. We always say, oh, you know, is there scope for an in-person meeting anymore? Do people really want to get together? Well, obviously, seeing you at lunchtime, all chattering away and networking made it worth it. So thanks for coming. Thanks for supporting us. TSF next Zoom meeting is on the 6th of June. Does that sound about right? I don't know. Have a look at our website and tell you
It's
all
on the
about it.
internet. But thanks also to the people who did join us remotely, I think, as well. Who all
Yes, I was about to say that. Thank you to the remote people as well.
Didn't
Yes.
want to exclude them by the fact that they were prevented from being in.
Yeah. And the technology worked this time, didn't it?
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Thank you.
I must remember to say that there is a session this evening for singing and enjoying yourself. Richard, can you tell us when?
We're thinking of gathering about 7:30 for 8 in the University Arms, which is...
Yeah, just to say again, so I don't know if you've probably all discovered the underpass now. So yeah, as you go out, turn left under the road and then turn left immediately on that pavement on the opposite side of the dual carriageway there. And it's literally just before you get to the roundabout at the bottom. It's 5 or 10 minutes walk at the most. And if you need any tips for eating places, there's some up the hill in Broom Hill, very nice suburb area, or you can go left down the road towards West Street. Actually, you could go right down and go on Glossop Road first if you dare, and then onto West Street, and that's more leading into town, and there's quite a lot of restaurants down there as well.
Good.
So, let's have a round of applause for our speakers today.